Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Chagigah. We're up to Perek Bet Mishnah Vav. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'elu Nishmat, Neria ben Svetlana, Aranbaev, Neliyahu ben Burcha Israelov, Menuchatam Megan Eden, Amen. And Le'avdi ben Chaim Nachaim, V'derefua Shelemav, Daniel Shalom ben Rosa, B'tor Shah Chulei Israel. The Mishnah teaches a rabbinic law dealing with the 5 levels of holiness. Hatoveh lechulin ve'uchzak lechulin. If one immersed himself in a mikveh for the purpose of eating chulin, ordinary food, and he had intended to establish himself as ta'ol for chulin, asur lema'aser, he is forbidden to eat ma'aser sheni until he immerses himself again for the purpose of eating ma'aser sheni. Under Torah law, a tameh person becomes ta'ol when he immerses in a mikveh, even if his intention was simply to bathe. The sages decreed, however, that he may not eat holy food until he immerses with the intent to become tahor. And if he intends to immerse for foods with a low level of holiness, he may not eat foods with a higher level of holiness. So if someone immerses with the intention to purify himself for eating chulin, he remains forbidden to eat maaser sheni. Although he immersed with intent to become tahor, he did not have specific intent for maaser sheni, and therefore remains forbidden to eat it. Strictly speaking, a person may eat chulin even while he is tameh. The Mishnah, however, is discussing someone who goes beyond the letter of the law and is careful to eat even his chulin food only when he is tahor. This was the common practice of Torah scholars in the times of the Mishnah. If he immersed himself for the purpose of eating maaser sheni, and he had intended to establish himself as tahor for maaser sheni, asur l'truma, he is forbidden to eat teruma until he immerses himself with intent to eat teruma. If he immersed himself for the purpose of eating teruma, and he had intended to establish himself as tahor for teruma, asur lekodesh, he is forbidden to eat kodesh until he immerses himself for kodesh. If he immersed himself for kodesh, and he had intended to establish himself as tahor for kodesh, asur lechatat, he is forbidden to handle chatat water until he immerses himself for chatat water. The requirement to immerse with intent for teruma applies only for eating it. Special intent is not required, however, to touch or handle teruma. Similarly, the need to immerse with intent for kodesh applies only for eating it and not for touching it. But the sages did require immersion with specific intent for handling chatat water, which rabbinically has the highest level of holiness. Now, after stating that immersion with intent for a lower level of holiness is ineffective for items with a higher level of holiness, the Mishnah discusses the reverse situation. If one immersed himself for the purpose of becoming tahor for a stricter level of holiness, he is permitted to eat an item of a lesser level of holiness, even though he did not intend specifically to purify himself for it. So if someone immersed for kodesh, for example, he may eat teruma, maaser sheni, and of course chulin. And one last teaching about intent. If someone immersed himself to bathe and not to establish himself as tahor, it is as if he did not immerse himself with regard to eating holy things. The immersion is effective for eating chulin, however, since no particular intention is required when immersing for chulin, but the immersion is ineffective with regard to eating holy things. And that is the end of Mishnah Vav. We continue now with Mishnah Zayin. The previous 2 Mishnayot discussed areas in which the laws of Tumah and Tahara differ for items of different levels of holiness. This Mishnah discusses another such area. Bigdei Amaretz Midras Lifrushin. The clothing of an Amaretz is considered tameh through Midras for Pirushim, namely for people who are careful to eat chulin even in a state of Tahara. Midras, literally treading, refers to the Tumah acquired by an object when a Zava, Nida, or a woman after childbirth rests his or her weight upon it, such as by sitting, standing, or leaning on it. It is also an Avatuma, which is able to transmit Tumah to people or utensils that touch it. So the clothing of an Amaretz is considered tameh through Midras. Therefore, if the clothing of an, for Pirushim, for people who are careful to eat even chulin in a state of Tahara, therefore, if the clothing of an Amaretz touches Pirushim or the utensils, it makes them tameh as a Rishon. An Amaretz, an unlearned person in this context, refers to someone who eats chulin without regard to its state of Tahara. He is therefore presumed to be careless concerning the laws of Tumah and Tahara, as the Gemara says in Barachot, page 47b. Pirushim, on the other hand, are people who are careful to eat even chulin only in a state of Tahara. Under rabbinic law, Pirushim must treat the clothing of an Amaretz as midras, so that if a parush or one of his utensils touches such clothing, he or it becomes tameh. Even if the Ha'aretz claims that his clothing is tahor, Perushim cannot rely upon him since he is careless in the area of tahara. They must therefore be concerned about the possibility that Ha'aretz's wife sat on the clothing while she was a nidah. Bigdei Perushim midras lochne teruma. The clothing of Perushim is considered tameh through midras for those who eat teruma, namely kohanim. Therefore, when clothing of Perushim touches those who eat teruma or the utensils, it makes them tameh. As explained, the sages enacted different rules of Torah for different levels of holiness. In our Mishnah's case, they decreed that someone who is careful about protecting the Torah of one level of holiness is still considered lax regarding higher levels. Therefore, although Perushim are careful to eat their chulin in a state of Torah, Kohanim who eat teruma, which is holier than chulin, must treat the clothing of Perushim as a midras. For although Perushim who eat only chulin are careful to protect their clothing from contact with the nidah, they do not exercise the same level of caution expected of those who eat teruma. Unlike the previous two Mishnayot, the text of this Mishnah skips the level of Maaser Sheni, going straight from Perushim who eat chulin and Tahara to Kohanim who eat teruma. The Gemara on page 19b explains there is a line missing from our Mishnah and it should be read: the clothing of Perushim is considered midras for those who eat Maaser Sheni. The clothing of those who eat Maaser Sheni is considered midras for those who eat teruma. The Rav fills in the missing lines of the Mishnah based on the Gemara in Chagigah, page 19b. Bigdei ochle teruma midras lekodesh. The clothing of those who eat teruma is considered tameh through midras for those who eat kodesh. So when such clothing touches those who eat kodesh or their kelim, the clothing makes them tameh. Bigdei kodesh midras lechatat. The clothing of those who eat kodesh is considered tameh through midras for those who handle chatat water, and when such clothing touches those who handle chatat water or their utensils, the clothing makes them tameh. Now the Mishnah mentions great sages who observe stringencies listed above. The Mishnah makes special mention of great sages who observe the midras decrees to emphasize that there are no exceptions to the rule. The decrees apply not only to ignorant or careless people, but even to pious sages. Yosef ben Yoezer haya chasid shebakehuna. Yosef ben Yoezer was the most pious Kohen in the priesthood. Being a Kohen, and thus one who ate teruma, he was surely careful to avoid tumah. Vayta mitpachto midras kodesh, and yet his cloth napkin was considered tamet to midras for those who ate kodesh, in accordance with the ruling that clothing of those who eat teruma is considered a midras for those who eat kodesh. Yosef ben Yoezer, the Nasi, and the preeminent Torah sage of his generation, was a Kohen who ate teruma regularly. Even when he did not intend to eat kodesh, he was surely careful to avoid tumah so as not to make his teruma tameh and inedible. And yet his napkin was considered tameh to midras for the next level of holiness, those who ate kodesh. This shows that even the clothing of great sages who avoided tumah with the intent of eating teruma was considered tameh for those who ate kodesh. Now the Mishnah speaks of clothing being a midras only as an example. Any utensil used for sitting or lying upon is capable of becoming a midras and is subject to the decree. Although a napkin is most often used for wiping hands, if it is designated as a cushion cover on which people rest their heads, it is capable of becoming a midras. Right? Yochanan ben Gudgeda haya ochel al taharat hakodesh kol yamav. Yochanan ben Gudgeda ate even chulin food according to the tahara standard of kodesh all the days of his life. His cloth napkin was considered tamet through midras for those who handle chatat water, in accordance with the ruling that clothing of those who eat kodesh is considered a midras for those who handle chatat water. Like we mentioned, kodesh has the second highest degree of holiness and therefore is subject to strict decrees enacted to protect its tahara. Some very pious people, such as Yochanan ben Gudgeda, whose family was renowned for its carefulness in matters of tahara, adopted the practice of even eating the chulin food with the same high standard of tahara as kodesh, to train themselves and their families for the stricter standards enforced when they would eat kodesh. Nevertheless, even the napkin of Yochanan ben Gudgeda was considered tamet through midras for the next highest level, those who handle chatat water. Now the napkin, though technically used for chulin, was considered a midras only for chatat water, not for kodesh itself, because in the view of this Mishnah, chulin prepared according to the tahara standards of kodesh is recognized as having the tahara level of kodesh. Therefore, if someone is careful to protect the tahara of chulin as strictly as he would that of kodesh, the chulin is not considered a midras for kodesh. And that is in Abotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.